You pay me what I'm worth. You give me what I'm worth.
We will always speak up for human rights. We will always speak up for women's rights.
The men have to be part of the solution.
I am here today to acknowledge and represent the African American girls whose stories don't make the front page of every national newspaper.
Women are in the world, and we will not be bullied.
Hello, everybody. I'm Tina Brown. I want to welcome you all to the second annual Women in the World Summit Canada. It is wonderful to be back, I must say. What a power-packed crowd this is. This is world domination that I'm looking at here. It's very, very exciting. I couldn't be more grateful for the fact that we're here to my dear friend Ron Lloyd, Chairman and CEO of Credit Suisse Canada, who 2 years ago came to Women in the World in New York and persuaded me to bring the summit to Toronto. And thank you, too, to our presenting sponsor, Credit Suisse, for whom Ron Lloyd, of course, is associated and is the CEO of Credit Suisse Canada. Credit Suisse is our leadership sponsor. P&G are supporting sponsors. Toyota and Thomson Reuters are our supporting sponsors, and our leadership. And I'm so sorry, I'm messing all this up so completely. It's all about my excitement about being here. So I'm going to sort of say that all again. Thank you to our presenting sponsor, Credit Suisse, our leadership sponsor, P&G, our supporting sponsors, Toyota and Thomson Reuters, and our media partner, the Globe and Mail. And thank you, David Walmsley. Thank God I got through it. Now, I want to assure you, I come in peace. Like all visitors from the US right now, I arrive with slightly nervous feelings, all right? You're not mad at us, are you? Please say you're not mad at us. Too many women understand what it's like to be stuck in a relationship with a boorish man who gratuitously insults the neighbors. Unfortunately, everybody else in the world now understands and feels that way too. But the good news is that now more and more of us on both sides of the border have gained a new appreciation of a relationship that's going to be a lot longer lasting than the relationship with the current President of the United States, and that's the all-important relationship, of course, between the US and Canada. Because Canadians and Americans share family ties and fundamental values and ideas, not to mention Samantha Bee's comedy, Margaret Atwood's novels, and Sarah McLachlan's music. Okay, so we have a lot to celebrate together. Now, for those of you who've not been here to Women in the World before, I want to just tell you a little bit about the background. I founded Women in the World in 2009 with a mission to bring stories and insights of extraordinary women leaders to the stage, women who live both in the headlines and behind the headlines, who risk their lives taking on injustice and inequality, or just contributing to the great debates of our moment. The summit took off, and every spring at Manhattan's Lincoln Center, we play to a sold-out audience of 2,500 people for 3 exhilarating days. And we've now expanded to London, India, Dubai, and of course here in Toronto. We've featured more than 900 female firebrands and thought leaders from 30 countries and across the United States over the last few years. And now, of course, the mission of Women in the World has met its moment. Me Too has focused what has been a long time coming, the need to blow up the status quo and make women full and equal in all aspects of life and work, and to make men our partners, our allies, our champions. So let's start with our first program. We're honored to have with us a true champion of women, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, in conversation with another remarkable leader and role model, IMF Chief Christine Lagarde, whose job is nothing less than ensuring the health of our global economy. 2 global champions of women who know how to deliver much more than a message. And we're delighted also to have Katie Couric, the legendary Katie Couric, moderating this conversation. So let's begin. Thank you.
women can just bring so much in terms of economic growth, in terms of profit to companies, in terms of common sense, in risk-taking policies.
In Canada, like all over the world, much of the economic and labor force growth we've experienced over the last many decades is because of women entering into and changing the workforce.
In 1976, 92% of women said sexual harassment was a problem. Now it's 99%.
This is not just a Hollywood problem. This is a problem that runs across industry around the world.
Hi, everybody. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Katie Couric, and as someone who's obsessed with The Handmaid's Tale, I just want to say I'm really happy I made it to Canada. So I'm happy to be here, happy to see all of you, and my two guests need no introduction, partially because Tina already did it, but I'm so pleased to be joined by self-described feminist, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and an extraordinary role model, Madam Christine Lagarde, who since 2011 has been Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. So welcome to both of you. And before we get to specifically to gender issues and the extraordinary work that I think you have both done on this topic, Prime Minister Trudeau, I just wanted to ask you, what's the latest with NAFTA? We got to make a little news here, people.
Sorry to disappoint, but we continue to work hard and be positively optimistic that we can get to a win-win-win for all three countries. You know, we are working hard, and we know that it's possible to get to it. We just have to keep working at it. The relationship between Canada, the US, and Mexico has created extraordinary economic growth over the past 2.5 decades. There's an opportunity to update NAFTA, and we're happy to be doing it. But as I've said, it has to be the right deal. It has to be a good deal.
Getting there has not been half the fun.
Well, you know what? I am lucky in this that I have an extraordinary woman leading up that charge, and Chrystia Freeland, who is absolutely amazing. She'll be here later today. You guys can give her all the props that she rightly deserves. We are incredibly lucky to have her around the table.
In fact, Madam Lagarde, I know as a former trade minister, you have a lot of respect and appreciation for what she's going through right now.
I have enormous respect and friendship for Chrystia, and I think that she's under huge pressure from all corners, and luckily she has the support of her Prime Minister and all women around the world who want her to succeed in her negotiations. She certainly has mine, big way.
All right, great. So let's get started on sort of the big topic that we're tackling today. I know that earlier this year, Prime Minister, Canada hosted the G7 summit, and you put women's advancement quite high on the agenda. Your Women's Advisory Council published a report called Make Gender Inequality History. With so many crises happening worldwide, why was this so important to you? Why make it such a high priority?
Well, the G7 is fundamentally an economic forum. It's a gathering of 7 of the most advanced economies in the world to talk about sort of the big issues and the big trends and the big challenges facing our economies, our workforces. And there is no question that increasing growth, increasing opportunity for everyone is not just a moral argument, it's a fundamental economic argument. So every G7, the
president country gets to set a couple of themes that are particularly important to dive into. And for example, we did one on oceans that is talking about oceans cleanup and oceans protection and showing global leadership as a council, which is great. But instead of doing that also with women, where there would be a session on women's empowerment or advancement, we said, no, we're making it a horizontal theme. So we put together a women's advisory council, gender advisory council, of which Christine was a special advisor, an important player on, to make sure that every single session, every single focus, ministerial meeting or agreement that came through the G7 had representatives of this Women's Council involved, engaged, to recognize that women's issues aren't just their own little silo. They touch on every single aspect of any economic conversation. And that horizontal approach is one that we're really delighted we were able to launch, have a significant outcomes to, and will continue next year with France's G7 leadership as well.
And Madam Lagarde, I know you've been focused on these issues for a long time. Certainly we've been hearing about these issues for a long time. I know with the Me Too movement, we're going to talk about that a little later in our conversation, they have greater urgency. But what other factors do you think are at work that are really propelling these issues front and center? What is going on? Why does it feel like kismet for at least the conversation, if not the action?
Well, first of all, let me tell you from my perspective, because I was sitting in all these G7 finance ministers, leaders meetings. And what Canada has done under the leadership of Prime Minister Trudeau is something that I would not have anticipated. You've made women discrimination, the whole issue of women, a topic that is an absolute must. And I think that you, for many of those countries that were involved, made it politically incorrect to actually be dismissive, be discriminatory, or be full of, you know, those very funny smiles that you get sometimes, you know? Oh, a woman issue, yes, of course. Well, that's no longer in the cards. And I have to tell you, huh?
Patronizing?
It's a combination of patronizing, vaguely amused, entertained. That is all gone. And, you know, it was...
Not all gone, well, but it's...
No, I'm talking about the G7 circle. I don't think that any other G7 leaders will dare say, no, I'm sorry, but I'm not putting this on the agenda. It's ancillary. You know, the way you put it up there, you insisted with your colleagues. We all women of the W7, because there was an advisory council that was composed of many talented women, including many Canadian women. The way we sort of looked at all these leaders in the eyes, it made it just impossible for them to either ignore or consider as secondary that particular topic. So it's both the horizontality and the height at which Canada put women that really made a huge difference in my view.
So we're talking about leadership.
We're talking about leadership, we're talking about the proper measurement of what it means, because as the Prime Minister said, it's an economic summit. And all those leaders are interested in solid, sustainable, inclusive growth. And if you say growth, it has to go through women. If you say inclusive, it has to go through women. If you say sustainable, it has to go through women. Because, you know, I'm not inventing, and I'm not, you know, talking about the moral side of it, but just at the IMF, we've done a lot of analysis of what it means. It improves growth, it improves inclusiveness, and it certainly improves diversification of the economy, which means more sustainable economies. And that ignores the whole climate change approach, which is also very often, how would I put it? Better, I think women tend to be more attentive to those issues than men in general. So, voila.
So it's good for, I concur with you, with present company excluded, but you know, clearly it's good for the bottom line, and yet 90% of countries still have at least one legal barrier to women's economic participation. These barriers impact 2.7 million women globally, include things like restricting their access to credit, denying them their ability to own property. So what will it take to remove those barriers?
I think
I think for a lot of time we do phrase it as sort of a moral or a human rights or an equality or a enlightened perspective that yes, you should liberate women, you should empower them, you should celebrate and support them as the right thing to do. And there's a lot of people who get that, for whom that is enough of an argument. But for when you look at the entrenched status quo, the way the power systems have evolved over the past decades and centuries, you realize that it actually takes a stronger, grounded argument in economic facts. And I think the example of Rwanda, for example, where after the genocide 20 years ago, there were so many more women in the workforce or needing to get into the workforce than men, that their economy and their opportunities have increased. We know that, and we shouldn't take a terrible tragedy to awaken ourselves, but there are studies after study, and Christine knows and has talked about a lot of them, that show that organizations with better gender balance, better diversity, make better decisions, not just more profits, but better, far-reaching, beneficial outcomes. Making an economic argument about better equality of opportunity is something that is harder and harder to stand against anywhere in the world.
But 90%, I mean, we've heard these economic arguments, honestly, with all due respect, for years, and yet it hasn't moved these countries to eliminate these barriers. So how can you do it? How can you force the issue?
First of all, Canada is not in the 90%. I checked before I came in.
Okay.
So at least your constitution, your rules, your principles do not embed any discrimination, which doesn't mean to say that you have total equality in terms of female labor force participation, in terms of gender gap. You still have issues, and Canada does. But for those 90 other countries, there has to be a sense of political determination, of leadership, of political correctness about fixing those issues. And it works. That's the other thing which we have demonstrated through our study. Because when you fix those discrimination, when you, for instance, you give access to finance, when you allow proper inheritance equally between genders, it changes the map. And there are various countries that have done it in the sub-Saharan African continent, in Latin America. Wherever the changes have taken place, there has been, as a result, within the next 5 years, a significant change in female labor force participation, in gender gap, and in women entrepreneurship. So it does work, and it does improve the bottom line, not just of corporations, but of countries as well. So we just need to rehash all the time and repeat and make the case as often and as loudly as we can. And I think that there are now, enough, there's never enough, but there are many of us who are very concerned that these things actually change, and our voice carries. And Tina is one of those who, year after year, is pushing those issues.
Meanwhile, Prime Minister, since the early 50s, Canadian women's participation in the workplace has grown to over 80%, but in the last decade, it's plateaued, and it still trails men by 9%. Why the plateau, and what needs to happen to restart this forward momentum and get Canadian women working in equal numbers?
And it's not just workforce participation, it's money earned on the dollar. You'd be surprised how low Canada is actually on pay equity, which is frustrating because we have different jurisdictions that brought in pay equity legislation a decade or more ago. We've just realized we have a lot more to do. A piece of it is sort of symbolic, is demonstrating that the cabinet can be half men, half women at the highest levels. It's about demonstrating that makes a better level of decision making. But more than that, and encouraging businesses to do that. But we do need concrete pay equity legislation. We do need transparency legislation as well, and we're moving forward on those kinds of things that will, eventually move the markers in a significant way. Because when women are not succeeding to the same level as men, our society is poorer. Over the past 40 years, over my lifetime, women entering the workforce have added a third to Canada's GDP. We're looking for where the next growth is coming from. That's an obvious place where proper empowerment of women entrepreneurs, of women in the workforce, is essential to create the kinds of growth and benefits that we need in our society.
You know, for what it's worth, there's one other area that maybe Canada wants to look into, because based on research that will be published shortly, women are more affected and will be more affected by artificial intelligence, biotech innovations, and automatization on the in the workplace. And it's quite fascinating to see that about 11% of women's job will be either completely removed or significantly affected, as opposed to 9% of men's job. So women are at a disadvantage. The numbers are a little bit higher for Canada, and I was really surprised by that. It also has to do with the fact that in the service industry, there are many tasks that are repetitive, that will be automated, and where Canadian women have their jobs, and that's where they will be hurt eventually. So I think anticipating that and, you know, putting in place the policies, helping people to adjust, making sure that they have the right skill sets in order to not resist, but adjust to those changes that will take place, I think will be fantastic.
That's really important for everyone, men and women, right?
Absolutely, and that's one of the things. The fact that we have invested massively in AI and we see Canada has leadership around that means nothing if we're not equipping our workforce, our citizens, to be able to handle that transition that is coming everywhere around the world. And that's why on getting women into STEM, we've had significant investments. There is now a lot of pressure on universities to make sure that the research chairs are more gender balanced. But it also means investing to get women entrepreneurs, more women entrepreneurs, investing to get more women in the trades as well, in terms of Red Seal trades. There's a lot of things that we have to do to prepare for the transition into the new work, and making sure from the get-go that we're looking at reducing barriers to women is essential, even if it weren't the fact that there is an inequality in the disruption potentially.
Let's talk about the elusive work-life balance, because Madame Lagarde, I mean, you've obviously been able to juggle motherhood and a very demanding career.
I've been able to juggle fatherhood.
I was going to ask you, don't worry. That you just, I was going to ask you.
Sorry, I think you were probably going there, and I cut off the gag. But
actually, my next question was, Mr. Prime Minister, what about you? I think part of the problem is women are always asked that question, men rarely are. Just so you don't think that I was being sexist against the Prime Minister. But you know, what have you learned along the way that you feel could help other women in terms of, and fathers, mothers and fathers, in providing more support, more recognition for unpaid work, paternity leave, all kinds of things that you think would then kind of be the wind beneath their wings as they try to have a more active professional life?
It takes a whole society. It's not just upon the policymakers, it's also upon the corporate world, it's upon society as a whole. I was lucky because, you know, when my two boys were born, I was a young associate in a law firm, but luckily I started my legal career in France. And France has these childcare centers and childcare facilities that are accessible, that they're not plenty. There is shortage, there could be more, but it was, you know, sufficiently available so that if you could plan your motherhood 2 years ahead, and register the kid to be born, then you would have access to a childcare center. But I was also lucky because I took that fight within Baker McKenzie, and I managed to get the partnership to agree that it's not because a young female partner goes on maternity leave, so to speak, for a month or 2 months, that she loses the benefit of her participation. So we put in place a system that equalized the participation, which is the compensation that partners were receiving, and the male partners, because it was, you know, vastly male dominated in those days, agreed that they would, you know, chip in and pay for that. So what I mean is, it's policies, childcare centers, special benefits made available for women who have a child, and I know that Canada is ahead of that in that game. But also in the corporate world, there has to be a recognition that women, for a portion of their life, are going to, at least for the moment, that we are the ones pregnant, we are the ones breastfeeding, we are the ones having those duties, and no matter how you know, supportive a partner is going to be, we still conduct those activities. And the corporate world has to appreciate, recognize, and you have this thing which is back to Bay Street business. Back to Bay Street. Does that mean something to any of you? Return to Bay Street. Return to Bay Street. For the financial sector, I think that's good. And many companies and corporates should acknowledge that and make sure that once a woman has contributed to a company, if she goes away for a period of her life, it should be made easier for her to come back, and there should be programs in place to accommodate and help her adjust to that world which she has left for a little while. And there's no reason why, as I did it for my first child, you go away for 2 weeks, you feel guilty for the rest of the next few months, and not the rest of your life, I have to say. When they grow up, they recognize.
I was so excited to go back to work after I had children, and I don't feel bad about it because they're great girls. Anyway, Prime Minister, what about the use it or lose it paternity leave, and really trying to make sure that fathers, while they can't breastfeed, at least not yet, that they take an active role in child rearing?
Well, I think understanding that there's a new generation of fathers who are wanting to be more engaged, and I think helping that along. Because if you imagine, we are bringing in next year, use it or lose it, 5 weeks of second parent leave, which of course will be mostly used by fathers, hopefully. Where if you imagine an employer hiring a 25-year-old. He's got to know that, or she's got to know that whether it's a man or a woman they're hiring, if they're going to start a family, there's a chance that they take time off. And that sort of evens things a little bit. More than that, it also gives men an opportunity to experience what I was just in a great roundtable with women entrepreneurs, being the primary caregiver for a few weeks. Understanding that it's you that has to change your plans because there was a bleeding nose at daycare or in grade 2. It's you who has to just sort of suddenly be the one stop for everything. I mean, I know I'm guilty of this. When I'm in charge, something goes wrong, I usually just have to wait till Sophie shows up and she helps me with the rest of the parenting stuff. And I'm a pretty good dad, but there is that idea of giving the responsibility to men in a very explicit way leads to the kinds of societal shifts that we need, where so much of the unpaid work, so much of the extra family tasks automatically fall on women, and they shouldn't. There should be much more shared equal parenting, and these steps are the kinds of things that, yes, government can do. And you're right, it's businesses, it's the whole of society, but we all have to figure out paths to be part of that, and that's why I'm glad we're doing that.
Gosh, I can't believe how fast the time has gone, because we don't have that much time left, which is super annoying, because I could talk to you all for another hour. But Madame Lagarde, let's talk about not just participation, but leadership roles. You obviously have had a number of extraordinary leadership roles throughout your career. It's still frustrating that more women are not given the top jobs in these companies and these corporations. What can be done to change that?
You know, I used to think that there should not be quotas, but I have massively changed my mind on that. And I think that if we do not have in place distributed quotas, I'll go one step further than what I used to say. It has to be distributed along the hierarchy of a company, because it's all very well saying there has to be parity. Yes, there will always be parity, but if you start distinguishing between the supervisory positions, the leadership positions, the management position, and then the sort of overall size of a company, it's a whole big difference between the top numbers, which are generally low, the bottom number that are very generally high, and the overall, which is pretty much average and makes everybody proud. Well, there has to be distributed quota, and if we want to make sure that there is the pipeline from which women will be selected and will prove themselves according to all the normal, regular rules. But if that pipeline is not in place, it's never going to happen. And for the pipeline to be there, we need to have those distributed quotas throughout the organizations.
And in fact, Prime Minister, less than 10% of Canada's senior corporate jobs are held by women. So what are you going to do about that?
Well, I mean, one of the things I talk about just in terms of the pipeline, and we were worried about that pipeline. That's why before it could be 2015 and we have a gender-balanced cabinet, I had to go out and we recruited in 2014, 2013, 2012, and got women to step up into politics. Now the challenge is around retention, because politics is still a very difficult game, and it's not necessarily there's still huge barriers and old boys approach in many ways that cause real challenges, and therefore how we're changing the culture within the political world we're in, including things like Me Too and sexual harassment, become really, really important around making sure that women make it from that entry level to the top level positions, and more of them. So it's not just the entry pipeline, as you've said, it's maintaining a progression throughout all levels of business and of politics. And that's something that requires constant engagement and mostly constant listening, open, safe conversations about the real challenges and the real barriers are really hard to have in a corporate or political session context, but they're so important.
And in closing, Madam Lagarde, I mean, how do you see the Me Too, Time's Up movements, which really have become global phenomenons? How do you see them changing the conversation and pushing these issues forward? Because as we saw in the video, and as I know you know, sexual harassment is a real problem in terms of keeping women in the workforce and even attracting them to some sectors of the workforce.
Well, they are more than welcome movements, and movements that, as you said, have spread in many advanced economies. I wouldn't think that, you know, all emerging and low-income countries have yet been contaminated properly, and they should be.
I like that phrase, contaminated properly.
Yeah, I think that it's critically important. And then there has to be that ownership by man and woman, both, that this simply cannot happen. And that it has to be talked about, it has to be raised at the highest level at all tables, and not just, you know, in the kitchen or in the backyard.
And having women in leadership positions is a very effective antidote.
Absolutely, yeah, that is, I mean, it certainly inhibits many of those who would otherwise not talk about it, fear of retaliation. So I think pushing the women at all levels of society, politics, private sector is critically important. And these women, once they're there, they have to carry the flag, and they have to protect, cover, enhance, and be the spokesperson as well, which they don't always do.
All right, on that bummer of a note, Madam Christine Lagarde, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, thank you both so much for being here today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you. Good afternoon again. I'm so thrilled to be sitting here with one of my heroes, Dr. Alvi from Calgary, because while the world was waiting for some kind of action, you know, after this UN statement, we all thought some kind of action would happen to help protect and save the Rohingya. We've seen Dr. Alvi, who didn't wait for anything. She has not been waiting for anything. She went off last October with her stethoscope and her medical books to the camps in Bangladesh to minister to these wretched Rohingya tormented refugees herself. And I have to ask you, Dr. Alvi, what compelled you to do this?
Thank you, Tina, for getting me here. I'm delighted to be here. So last year when the massive the campaign of violence started, I was hearing all these stories of massacres, violence, rape, and being raised in a developing country, Pakistan, I knew that these countries have so much trouble to deal with their own issues rather than having an extra million mouths to feed. And I just couldn't sit and watch. So I talked to my friends, 2 of my colleagues went with me, and the conditions on the ground really shocked me. Just imagine, like 1 million people, traumatized, sick, injured people living in those flimsy bamboo tents. They have nothing. They know no food, no water, no sanitation, even no clothing. So after I came back, I tried doing what I could to raise awareness to their conditions. And thank you, Tina, for helping me with that, and everyone in Women in the World. Eventually, what stuck with me the longest, the hopelessness of their future. The Rohingya crisis was in the news media maybe for a week, and then everybody forgot about it to focus more on Trump and Stormy Daniels and so forth. Unless there is some real international pressure, this crisis won't end. So as a woman, as a doctor, especially as a mother, I was horrified to see the conditions that the Rohingya are living in.
We went back again last month, right? And why did you feel, what happened when you went back this second time? Had there been any improvement on the ground in the time since you went last year?
Actually, this trip last month, it was a continuation from the first one, because when I came back, we started with my friends, we started sponsoring a medical clinic, and we are hiring local Bangladeshi doctors and buying medications. But I thought that, the need is way more, and just giving them medical relief is not enough. So I need to go back and to understand the origin of the crisis. So in this trip, in addition to giving medical care, I spoke to a lot of Rohingya. And to get a better idea how the crisis began and what they think the solution could be. As Nelson Mandela said, hatred must be taught, and it has been taught for generations in Myanmar. In the past, the members of Rohingya community, they were treated as second-class citizens, and it escalated to a point they were not considered even human beings.
Totally dehumanized, totally to be dehumanized. I want to play a clip of one of the women that you treated just a few weeks ago. The woman was named Gulbahar, and Women in the World's camera crew accompanied you and shot this footage. Do you want to just play this clip? Because it gives a sense of the kind of work that Dr. Alvi is doing.
Thin, she's so thin. She does not have any muscles, any fat. Tell her that I'm gonna check her stomach. If it hurts, let me know, okay? Does it hurt here?
This place.
I don't have any food. I only eat when someone shares their curry with me. Otherwise, I go without food.
You can ask her to sit up.
I escaped with my neighbors. They carried my grandsons for me, and another neighbor helped me walk. I feel so lonely. I try to walk around the camp and leave my tent, but nothing feels good anymore. With a sick body, my life is coming to an end soon, and all around me is turmoil and anxiety. Sometimes I cannot hold my tears back.
What will become of this woman?
So this woman, we met this grandmother. She brought her 2 very sick grandkids to the clinic, and herself was sick. And on exam, I suspected a cancer. She has an abdominal mass. And she told us that when they killed her son and his wife, she fled to Bangladesh with the help of neighbors and brought these 2 grandkids, 3 and 5-year-old, to Bangladesh. And on the way, she broke her wrist also, and she had some other condition also. She had tremors all over the body. So she was not in any condition to take care of herself, and she's responsible for those 2 young grandkids. So as a mother, I was worrying about those grandkids. What's going to happen to them if something happens to Gulbahar? And this is a normal scenario in those tents. The lack of chaos, the chaos and the lack of authority in these tents make these children vulnerable for human trafficking. And there are a lot of reports already. So it was really hard on me.
Well, it's incredible to think that these 2 kids are dependent on this woman who clearly is, just out of the kindness of her heart, and now she's suffering so badly herself. Were there other aid workers on the ground? I mean, why is the camp itself so chaotically administered?
You know, just imagine there's like 1 million people living in those tents in such a short amount of time. Basically, they came in within the major influx came in the last year, in those 2-3 months. And there's a lot of NGOs working on the ground, lots of them, half of them, they have pulled their aid back now because it's been a year, there's nothing happening to them.
Well, this is what's so really awful. I mean, I was very struck with what you said to me about how you felt there was so much wasted potential in these camps, that there are all of these people who have such human potential, and it seems like they have absolutely no feeling, belief, or actuality of getting out of there.
You know, when we go there, this time and last time, I met lots of people, especially teenagers. They were just hanging out, nothing to do, nowhere to go. And this one boy told me that he could not, in Myanmar, he was a very bright student, and he passed the admission test to the medical college, but he could not get into med school because he was a Rohingya. So, you know, I was thinking that often we say that where's the next Albert Einstein? What about if the next Einstein is a girl in Africa and she's not getting education? What about if the next Einstein is a Rohingya boy in Myanmar who is struggling to survive and now wasting his life in these camps? So the point I'm trying to make that there's a loss of human potential in these camps, and the whole ethnicity is wasting their lives there.
The amazing thing that I think people don't realize is how long and how brutal the persecution of the Rohingya have been, just simply because they are Rohingya. And I'd love to sort of put up on the screen here, if we can, the list of all the things that the Rohingya are not allowed to do in Myanmar. So these are the things, I mean, now they're fleeing completely, but these have been the things that for years, decades, generations, they have not been allowed to do in Myanmar. Can we see that slide? Look at all these things. They can't have birth certificates. They can't have healthcare. They can't have high school, university, freedom to travel, smartphones, electricity after dark. This is really about squeezing people to death. I mean, it's like what happened with the Nazis when they gradually eliminated one by one all the freedoms of the Jews until they were finally gassing them. And why do you think it is that the world doesn't seem to be interested in what is going on there in such a systematic way?
I don't know, to be very honest, because when I talk to Rohingya and listen to that, you know, they were persecuted like for the last 40 years. And as human beings, we need some basic necessities to survive and run a society. Burmese thought that by denying Rohingya that, they would leave on their own. Evidently, it did not happen. So they started to escalate the process. The world politics is very different, but it's a shame for me to say that this genocide is going on right in front of our eyes, and we are not doing a thing about it. We are doing nothing about it.
Well, you treated unbelievable, you know, these sad stories, these patients. I want to share the clip of a young mother named Sumida who tells her story in her own words. Let's see that clip of Sumida.
The military killed 3 of my family members. I lost my father-in-law, my husband, and my husband's younger brother. The military was firing bullets at the people, and they were throwing dirty water back at the soldiers. There was blood and guts everywhere. The military dragged all of the women in a room. That's when they took my husband and my baby. They did what they wanted with us. They raped us. We were locked in the room so we couldn't escape. They killed everyone else in the village, and then they left. I spend all day thinking that I have nothing anymore. I don't have any desires, just the desire to die.
What do you think is going to happen with Sunita? Will she stay there? Will she ever escape? Are any of them getting out?
It's really hard for me to answer that. You know, this really struck me in this visit. There's a beautiful young 19-year-old girl, and as you saw in the video that they dragged her husband, when they took her husband, he was carrying their 6-month-old baby who was found 2 days later covered in the blood near the dead body of his father, barely alive, by another woman. And Samita was gang raped. So Samita made to Bangladesh with this baby and with her younger brother. And she figured it out that she was pregnant. She still doesn't know who is the father. Is her husband or one of the many soldiers who raped her? So Samita's story is very typical of other women in Rohingya villages. There were about 90,000 pregnant women. Most of them were pregnant due to rape. And there are lots of reports now within the last year because it's a shame for them. They tried to abort themselves with unsterilized needles and bamboo sticks and ended up getting a nasty, life-threatening infections. I have lots of reports that the women were raped in front of their children. Sometimes they were raped beside the dead bodies of the children. There are really no words to describe, the crime of this scale is. So the point I'm trying to make, these Rohingya mothers, they are human beings like us. And they have the same organs, they have the same heart that feels the pain. And again, I'm ashamed to say that as their fellow human being, that we are not doing anything about them. Lots of Rohingya told me that when they were escaping to Bangladesh border from Myanmar, they saw lots of newborn babies, some of them with their cords attached, some of them with their dead mothers on the side, some of them were alone because mothers were too weak to carry them to the borders because they were literally surviving on banana leaves. So what kind of humanity is there? And I was, as a mother, as a woman, I was shocked to hear that.
I think what is also very shocking is that Aung San Suu Kyi, who got a Nobel Prize, a Nobel Peace Prize, has done absolutely nothing now that she's out of house arrest and now that she's involved in politics. And she has done absolutely nothing to stop, to speak out against this Buddhist hatred. And I mean, why do you think this Buddhist hatred has become so intense? I mean, why do they hate the Rohingya as much as they do?
I don't know, because to me, and talking to lots of Rohingya, these Buddhists and the Myanmar army, they have cultivated hatred and violence against Rohingya. They are breeding hatred literally for generations. So as a doctor, when I went there, I was struggling to address that pain because the Rohingya know it, that why they are persecuted, why they are targeted, because it's not like they have done something wrong, because they exist in this world. So it's a very broader injury, broader trauma, it's a generational trauma, and I did not know how to address that pain. After coming back, Tina, this time, I was talking to my colleagues. There were textbook of psychiatry, DSM-5. They need to design a definition for the trauma and pain the Rohingya have gone through, because PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, does not accurately describe what the Rohingya have gone through. They know it, they feel it, that they are targeted because they are Rohingya, they exist.
That's unbearable to even consider, because there's no remedy for them of that situation, of who they are. I mean, one tends to think that Aung San Suu Kyi, frankly, should be giving back her Nobel Prize, and why she has not spoken out is deeply distressing. Do you think that the international community should be shaming her more for that?
Of course. I don't think so. She was an innocent bystander. She is complicit in her actions. Whenever she talks, defends her army, and she has said or done nothing. And people living in Canada and United States, we have to recognize that she has no right to the Nobel Prize that she won and the honorary citizenship that our country gave her.
Well, that would be nice to see revoked. I think that would be an excellent thing, perhaps, if Canada could revoke that citizenship, in repudiation of her disgraceful lack of humanity in this situation. Canada just pledged $300 million for these refugees. Do you think that, what can the international community do? Practical terms. I mean, the camps themselves are in terrible conditions, correct? I mean, what would you like to see happen now, aside from the obvious, which is this actually stops? What are the practical steps that could be taken to help the Rohingya at this moment?
It's great that Canada has stepped up and announced this big aid. It's more than most nations are giving, but actually this aid money is not going to do anything. It's just like putting a Band-Aid on the bleeding vessel. If we send even billions, it's not going to address it. I like Canada to step up And especially our Prime Minister, I like him to step up because he's one of, people know it, that he's one of the good guys, and the stances he will take are going to be the moral ones. So I want him to step up and declare at least what it is. It's a genocide. Because Canada has not declared it is a genocide. It's going on right in front of our eyes, and we are not doing anything about it. So I think, being Canadian, I like Canada to step up and take some concrete steps to make an impact on this crisis. And also, I have a couple of suggestions for our Prime Minister, because the Burmese are, as I said earlier, are, the breeding hatred for generations. The Rohingya were not allowed to get education. So, and army, before the main push last year, they hunted down their education, anybody who has secondary education and professionals like engineers, doctors, in order to deprive Rohingya of their leadership. So it is also hard to rebuild the society, functioning society after that, just as we see Cambodia. So we really need to educate those people. And I was thinking to have a suggestion, like bring those at least 1,000 people to Canada and for 5 years and educate them in the Canadian universities so that they can go back and rebuild their society. Because what's happening now, the people who are advocating for Rohingya, the NGOs, they are not Rohingya. Rohingya does not have a leadership. Sometimes the NGOs have their own agenda. Even I cannot advocate for Rohingya because I don't understand the full situation. I have not gone through that.
Well, obviously, not everybody here is as brave as you. I mean, let's face it, you did something extraordinary. You stepped up, your humanitarian gesture and what you put behind it was extraordinary. But for those of us who want to help the Rohingya today, what can we actually do? What are the things that this audience can now do? You have a foundation, correct?
Yeah, I have a foundation. I work with a charity organization that's based on Canada, ICNA Relief, ICNA Relief. So I really appreciate that if everyone can support that organization, because I have seen their work on the ground. And I have seen the bigger organization work also. These people are really helping Rohingya. So if you can donate. The other thing, I want you to support your Prime Minister, no matter what the party you guys are. It doesn't matter. We have to gather up together as Canadian, as human beings, to support these mothers who are waiting for our support. And
you had a suggestion of a hashtag too, please.
Yes. So and if you guys cannot do anything, please hashtag my message about the Rohingya. That Rohingya need justice. They need international protection.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alvi. You are a very brave and wonderful person. I think all of us here admire you tremendously. I'd like to now thank you on behalf of all of us for what you have done.
Thank you, Tina.
There's no question that there's an unprecedented public conversation and concern about sexual harassment going on.
It's a watershed moment.
Stop the violence, stop the hate! Stop the violence, stop the rape!
There's still a long way to go. NBC News actively covered up Harvey Weinstein's abuse of women.
I urge all of us to not only support survivors and bystanders who are brave enough to tell their truth, but to promote restorative justice.
It's time to get Al off the bench.
What started as a simple exchange of empathy between survivors has now become a rallying cry, a movement builder.
What he was effectively telling me while he held my genitals in his hand was that he held the power.
All around the world, there are workers in every industry with a powerful person potentially threatening them and with not enough accountability to stop that.
Goodness, well, we have a lot to get through. Our
question is, what is wrong with men? If I'd been framing the question, I would have said, what the hell is wrong with men? But what an extraordinary day to be having this conversation with this extraordinary panel, given the news yesterday that Les Moonves was finally let go from CBS. I think so. And the 5 most frightening words, I think, in the English language now for any CEO must be, hello, this is Ronan Farrow. Can you imagine? And also, all those men out there, and some women too, because we don't want to pretend that it's only men that bully, imagine knowing that that phone call might be coming. Quite extraordinary. Anyway, we have an unbelievable panel to talk about this with: the broadcaster Amanda Paris, Michael Ian Black, author, comedian, and actually wrestling with a book called, what's your book called? Just tell everybody the title.
A Better Man.
A Better Man. So we'll come back to that and test him. But I think he deserves a round of applause for actually being here. A white man. Mira Sorvino, of course, Oscar-winning actress, and of course you launched or you premiered Mighty Aphrodite, for which you won the Oscar here in Toronto, right?
I did, yes.
1996, and an astonishing campaigner for Me Too, as is Amber Tamblyn, the actor, author, and poet. Mira, I want to start with you because you were one of the first people that came out with Ronan Farrow talking about Harvey Weinstein. I wanted to ask you about your year. What's it been like?
My year has been tumultuous, painful, triumphal, all of the above. I think it was a good move for me personally to make the decision to be honest about my experiences with Harvey, and then to join the forces of leagues of other women and men who are survivors in the Me Too and Time's Up movements. And you know, I have been a Goodwill Ambassador for the United Nations on Human Trafficking since 2009, and I've come to realize in my activism career that activism means nothing if it's not, awareness means nothing if it's not coupled with action. So I've tried to take my ability to speak to you all about sexual assault, harassment, abuse, rape, and turn it into something positive and measurable by getting behind legislation. So this spring and winter, actually, we started something called #TakeTheLead, where we were fostering 3 bills for California, actually 4, but 3 have passed. They're the strongest slate of anti-sexual harassment bills in the nation. They are concerning the statute of limitations, lengthening it from 1 to 3 years, which is still not enough. Those survivors, like myself, would like to see no statute on harassment, but it's a start. Redefining the definition of who can be a harasser. So in this gig economy, it doesn't have to be directly the person who hired you. In Los Angeles and California, in my business, we're the ultimate gig economy. There's so many different people who are involved in your place of work. It doesn't have to just be the producer or the studio. It could be your director, a casting agent, your agent, any number of people in your workplace who could be guilty of sexual harassment. We're also ending the one grope rule. There's a ridiculous, arcane rule on the books that says a man can squeeze a woman's breast once at work, and that's not considered harassment.
Oh, it's unbelievable, isn't it? Unbelievable.
Yeah, it is truly unbelievable.
And how many times are we allowed to squeeze them? Just remind me.
I don't know.
Who
I don't
would
know.
want to
But
squeeze
ask
them?
Terry Crews, because it affected him the same way. But another thing that most people aren't aware is that in many employment contracts, employers unscrupulously will put in a clause getting the person to sign away their ability to sue for sexual harassment. And often it's wrapped up in an advancement or a bonus. And then when these people actually do have a situation where they say, wait a second, I've been sexually harassed, what can I do? They are told, oh, you've actually signed away your ability to sue. So this legislation gets rid of all of that and also engenders training, statewide training for all employees of organizations working in California, not just higher echelon. So imagine having like this room full of people. Say if all of you had undergone sexual harassment training and then somebody in this room got harassed by someone else, you'd have this community of people who knew what to do about it. And there's something called bystander intervention training, which is explicitly mentioned in this legislation, so that you would have a pathway to help, a pathway to become a force to be reckoned with, and to stop this atmosphere of impunity, which we see Hollywood power brokers and people in every other industry have been enjoying basically forever. The medical industry, academia, corporate culture, politics, everywhere this happens, there are victims everywhere. And although, yes, men are the majority of the perpetrators, the victims are certainly not all women. And some of the perpetrators are female too. But we're so excited because these 3 bills have just passed all of the California legislation. I was literally on the phone with all of these offices over the last few weeks, calling them and being like, please let me tell you why we, the survivors, support this legislation. And you may say, well, it's one state, but California is home to 12% of America's women, of the United States' women, and our legislation is often copied by other states and even other countries. So we see this as something that we could have spread like wildfire, and we are now so excited because perhaps Governor Jerry Brown will make this his legacy impact statement by basically being very pro-women, pro-worker, anti-sexual harassment, anti-discrimination, pro-equality, and sign these 3 bills into law in the next couple of weeks. So we're counting on you, Governor Jerry Brown. Everyone here is listening. Let's all tweet about it. So for me to see that happen when I saw these 3 bills get passed by all of the senators and committees and everything, I was like, wow, we're doing something. We're achieving something tangible. We are not just outcrying, which is great, and I love seeing, people being exposed and losing their power from their abuses of it. But I want to prevent it from happening in the first place.
Right, and it's incumbent on everybody to let people know that this legislation is in the offing, as you say, tweet about it,
yes.
And for HR departments to feel empowered so when people go to them complaining about it, they don't shush them up. Amber, I want to bring you in here. You've also been a very active member of Time's Up and Me Too. You were harassed, tried to bring it to people's attention, and no one took any notice, right? Do you think it's easier for people to talk out now, to speak up now?
Yeah, I mean, I just believe so much in everything that Mira just said, as far as, there has to be action behind the activism, that there has to be some sort of proactive trajectory that we're all on behind the anger. I've often described it, especially women right now are sort of are in this combined conversation of being angry and organized. So they're angrenized, I call them. and I think that some of the most profound change is happening right now, but still that there's not enough. And part of it always goes back to this abuse of power, and that the Me Too movement ultimately was about exactly that, is about not just sexual harassment and sexual assault, but also just people who are in positions of power that abuse it and that keep others marginalized or held down or not allowed into those rooms, and ultimately boxed out of conversations creatively and otherwise in which they absolutely have the right to exist. I think one of the best examples that I just saw, which stirred up so much emotion in me, so I can't even possibly imagine how much emotion it stirred up in black women, certainly in America, but is watching this recent match with Serena Williams, which was just, for most women that I know, I had a woman who worked at Fox for a very, very long time, very powerful woman who created a very famous television show, text me about it to just say, that is every experience that a woman has ever had when she is frustrated or angry in a room and she is expressing herself in her God-given right to emotionally express herself, is to say, don't do that, because no one wants to listen to anything other than rational thought, and that there is no space in this world for emotional communication, for emotional intelligence. And I think that experience, watching it for me and watching it for my friend, brought back so much of that sense of like, me calling out an actor and saying he tried to pick me up at 16 had nothing to do with that necessarily. It had to do with all of the James Woods, all of the ones that are like him, that sit in positions of power, that sit in verbal states of authority and authoritative positions and act as though they are the arbiters of what should or shouldn't be done, what consequences should or shouldn't be given to somebody. And my frustration with that has always just been the deferment and looking at women and saying, this is so important that we level the playing field, that there is equality, not just in the workplace, but in every aspect of our daily lives, in the conversations that we're having, that we have to keep remembering that the power is within all of us to have those conversations, and we all have to hold our own selves accountable as far as saying, what am I doing, not just to help, but what am I doing to harm? That's the thing that I know I ask myself on a daily basis.
Do you, as both members, founder members of Time's Up and of Me Too, what do you think about CBS saying they want to give 20 million to the Me Too movement? Do you see that as them looking for air cover, given that this has taken 4 weeks since Ronan Farrow's original piece about Les Moonves?
I think it's a good first step, but that's not how he gets out of trouble. He has to be pursued through the criminal justice system, just as Harvey Weinstein is being pursued. There have to be real consequences. Rich people don't get a get-out-of-jail-free card. Not anymore. That's not, you know, it's time to really achieve justice for victims. So, great, that 20 million, it's not million, it's not billion, it's million, right? Yeah.
It's 20 million, yes. 20 million.
That should help if it goes to the Legal Defense Fund.
Yeah.
But his individual victims that have been named in these articles, I don't think they're getting any of that money. So where's their justice? There still has to be justice, restorative justice for them.
I want to see one of these guys own it. That's all. I want to see just one of them own their bullshit.
Okay, so that's
own it.
Great note.
I get tired of hearing the excuses. I get tired of the victimization, of the feeling sorry for themselves, of coming out and telling jokes about rape whistles and not even mentioning anything about something and pain that you have physically inflicted on another person. And I think that this is what I mean when I say that I wish there was self-policing by men and by communities, women too, who are in positions of power and abuse that. But what they don't seem to understand is that this healing can only happen if we are really having those transparent conversations. And the transparency is not just about us telling our stories and coming out here and putting ourselves on the line every single day. It's about men stepping over their own comfort line and saying, I did this. Not only do I do this, I see this every day in the workplace with men I work with, and I'm calling them out, and I'm going to speak to it, and I'm going to help move that along so that it's not just on the burden of somebody else, predominantly women, to do it.
Okay, so let me bring in Michael here, and I feel unfortunately you've now got to answer on behalf of all men everywhere. But there was one very interesting moment recently. Louis C.K., the comedian who, well, you all know what Louis C.K. did, right? I don't need to go back through that, but you tweeted saying that you noticed he was back out and that you were happy for him. And then Twitter sort of exploded at you and you were forced to sort of retreat. Can you talk a little bit about the notion of redemption for these men?
Yeah, well, you're slightly mischaracterizing what I said. I did not say I was happy to see him back. I said I was happy to see him try. And there were a lot of complicated reasons for that, why I wrote that. Ultimately, it was a mistake on my part, and I'm not going to sort of relitigate my own case against myself, but I apologized a lot. And I think Amber's right that the question that you just asked, when am I doing harm and when am I helping? I think that's an important question. In my case, the mistake I made was actually believing that I was helping a conversation and in fact was causing harm by trying to have that conversation. And it wasn't about redemption for me in terms of Louis. It was about the idea that you were just touching on, about how for men who are accused and, in Louis' case, admit to doing these things, how do we place them on a spectrum? Because there is a spectrum. How do they address their own lives moving forward when they're not subject to the criminal justice system? And you may be right that they should be. But in Louis' case specifically, and I kind of picked him because he was so sort of imperfect, because he's somebody who is maybe irredeemably flawed and maybe redeemably flawed, but he's not a guy who you look at and can say he has publicly gone on the apology tour or done rehab or done any of those things in public. But is he irredeemable?
Well,
please.
A friend of mine, Maureen Herman, a journalist and former musician, an amazing person, wrote a really fascinating article exactly about Louis C.K.
I tweeted it.
Okay, it's really fascinating because she talks about, she felt, was it too soon? Yes, it's too soon, because he has done none of these things to signal to the audience at large, not just the audience in that room that night that didn't ask to see him. So it offended a lot of women in the audience, and a lot of men loved that he was back. But that you can't undo what you did. He cannot take back those moments where he arguably psychically scarred those women forever with that situation. But he could show devotion to the cause of righting those wrongs in the future. She spoke about Klansmen who were no longer, who had a kind of come to Jesus moment and were no longer racist, and now tried to train other bigots to not be racist. She spoke about drunk drivers who had killed people, who now devote all their spare time to going to AA meetings and informing fellow people struggling with addiction how her actions had irrevocably taken the life of another person. So that there was a sum total contribution to society after the takeaway with his former actions. He has shown none of that, and it's as though he just expects, well, I've been out of it for a little while. But one of the things she said, it's not called, oh God, what? It's not called time out. It's called time's up. So it's not like you get a timeout. Okay, you spend 40 minutes in your bedroom, young man.
You know what?
All right. So if you see a person who has genuinely positive
but the
feelings,
fact that he also didn't say anything in this set that he came out, the fact
and he
that
made a rape whistle joke. How offensive
but
is
it just
that?
tells me he didn't go do the work. So you spent a year doing what? Like sulking, rewatching your movies? I don't know what he was doing. But when you have that time, and I understand, maybe that was not, these things need to be taught in all of us, right? We all need to learn how to change and grow, and that maybe even a Louis C.K. needs someone in his life to help him see how he was part of the problem in that moment, and that there was a real space for him to be able to come, and there probably still will be, to go do stand-up and to be able to talk about those things. But he didn't in that moment.
I want to bring Amanda in here. You're a broadcaster. You worked at CBC, where, of course, there was a famous Me Too scandal. And you've also worked in the music business. How similar is this debate that we're having in America going on in Canada?
Well, I didn't work in the music business per se, but I was kind of aligned closely to it. I mean, I don't think this conversation is one that's defined by borders or nations. It's something that exists everywhere. Patriarchy is something that exists everywhere. Misogyny is something that exists everywhere. And women throughout the world have been in danger for a very long time, and so have some men. In Canada, we've been engaging in this conversation in a public way a little bit before there was ever something called Me Too or Time's Up, partly because of that case that you mentioned with Jian Ghomeshi. And it was a conversation that played out in the public and forced us to think about how these stories are written, the responsibility of reporters, how they are framed, who gets to speak, who is centered in these conversations, and then how it plays out in the criminal justice system. So, I mean, I think the desire to see these things tried in court makes sense on paper, but what if the court system is flawed? What if the court system doesn't necessarily have, what if the court system doesn't have a good history of dealing with these things either? What if the court system has been structured in such a way that does still privilege the voices of men, the perspectives and stories of men, or the defense of men? And so I think this is something that we've been grappling with for some time, and the fact that it kind of exploded in the United States in this particular way just gave us another frame for it and more connections to talk about this issue in general, but this issue particularly when it comes to men who have a ridiculous amount of power, and a power that goes unchecked in so many ways and gets normalized in so many ways. And then what does that play out into in day-to-day interactions, and how does that play out into the ways that other people's opportunities are limited, and the ways that other people become threatened and silenced by that power.
And that power also, I think it's worth pointing out, in Les Moonves' situation, gets enormously rewarded financially too.
Of course.
And it's quite astonishing, the idea that he was sitting there negotiating for the last few weeks his enormous payout. So let me ask you all, because we've got time just for one brief final answer, and as you know, this conversation could go on for weeks, and undoubtedly it will go on for many months. But let me ask you all, what do you hope for next steps to be? And Amber, I'm going to start with you and then have everybody do a lightning round to the end.
I hope, my hope is that more men take the lead of a Michael Ian Black, who is someone who I've admired a very long time for his work. Huge Stella fan. But this idea to be able to take ownership of the mistake and to say, to look at it and go, I don't want to hurt, I don't want to harm, I want to help. And ultimately for more men to police themselves so that we all don't have to do it.
Fair enough.
You know, there's all of these incredible programs that are working with youth right now. And I think that's where the future lies, because you have to get to people early to get kids to understand, first of all, what their boundaries are, what they are able to say no to, what their rights are. But secondly, to raise a culture of men that does not have this enormous pressure to constantly score, to test their masculinity by how many people they've banged, rather than having mutual respect and meaningful relationships. What a concept. But the idea that, you know, when we think of our pop culture, and I brought this up before, but there was a John Hughes movie in which the nerdy guy is obsessed with the pretty girlfriend of the high school football player. And he goes to a party, and he's like, Molly Ringwald's in love with him, and his girlfriend is drunk in a room, and he's like, you know what, I don't want to have her, you can have her. And so the nerdy boy picks up the drunk girlfriend, puts him in his convertible, and she is incoherent. She is incapable of any kind of consent. He is so excited, she falls into his lap, face down onto his lap. He's elated. Cut to, he dumps her on her front porch. He has now lost his virginity, and yay, he's now a man. And that is the kind of culture that our culture has told men, this is being a man's son. You know, get a stripper for your, you know, your night before you're getting married. Go to a whorehouse to celebrate your coming of age. Fraternities, like having these parties and, you know, just kind of how many people did you score with, and, you know, and I spoke to a young man the other day who had just graduated from an Ivy League institution. He said everybody there is very worried because they feel like now anything they do is going to be taken out of context and they're going to be accused of improprieties. And I said, well, if you really look at women empathetically and you really do ask affirmatively for consent, you just have to be like, are you okay with this? Is this something you want to do? And he said, well, there's such a thing, though, as physical consent, nonverbal consent. And I was like, that won't cut it in this day and age. You really have to ask people, is this something you want to do? And if they say no, okay, sex is over. But that way, you're not a bad person. And we have to think of, you know, I think it's been compartmentalized. Good men in so many other arenas have had this Lothario side, this side of conquerors of women and marauders in a way. And I think we have to bring those two things back together and say, no, you are one whole person. You have to be good and empathetic in every area of your life, and that will only strengthen you as a man. It's not going to diminish.
All right, Michael, apart from buying a copy of your book, A Better Man, what, quickly, what do you hope for next steps?
So you're asking a question that I think Mira actually just answered beautifully, and I'm thinking and writing a lot about this in terms of next steps, next immediate steps in terms of what this conversation has been about. I think it has to be for guys to not just hear what women are saying, but really listen and process. And right now, I think a lot of men are in a very defensive crouch. And you have to, as a guy, be okay in that discomfort, because it is uncomfortable.
Yeah. All right, Amanda, very final word to you, and then we have to scarper.
three things. One thing a friend, Marlon Palmer, said at a profile on a panel that we were on recently. As a man, he's seen this the way white people should see conversations around racism. As soon as someone accuses them and lets them know that they have been racist, the immediate thing is defensiveness, and then hopefully they'll start to listen. And once he recognized it in that way, he said, oh, as a young black man, I don't want to be that stupid racist white person that doesn't think that they're racist, so let me just listen and check myself. Two, we need sex ed curriculum that is going to teach our children how to protect themselves, how to defend themselves, how to understand, to have the resources and the tools to do all of those things. And in Ontario, we need it right now, not any time later. And then the final thing, for all of my peers in journalism, that we frame these stories in ways that are responsible, that have nuance, that understand texture, and recognize that when we're putting the story out there, we are doing a huge disservice when we write it simplistically.
Okay, Amanda Parrish, Michael Ian Black, Mira Sorvino, Amber Tamblyn, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I don't remember much, but I remember being on the ground. He was over top of me. My clothes were off. I kept saying, like, you're hurting me. The next thing I know is there's a bunch of people with camera phones taking pictures. I don't know what they're doing, and they're saying things.
Came to the RCMP wanting to personally contribute to your community, and we failed you. We hurt you.
The numbers are now in, and they revealed over 250 of these cases have been incorrectly classified as unfounded.
Hello, everyone. I'm Habiba Nosheen. I'm the co-host of CBC's The Fifth Estate, and I'm delighted to be here today with these women to talk about a very important investigation by the Globe and Mail that's also sparked a lot of dialogue in Canada about policing and the way that crimes against women are investigated. I'm joined by Police Chief Leanne Fitch from Fredericton, Robin Doolittle of the Globe and Mail, and Pamela Palmter, a lawyer, professor, and a social justice activist. Welcome. Robin, I want to start with you. Unfounded was a 20-month-long investigation by the Globe and Mail that examined sexual assault cases classified by the police as unfounded. What made you want to embark on this investigation, and were you surprised by the findings?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always loath to start a conversation with Jian Ghomeshi, but that is where this story started for me. I'm sure you guys don't need a recap of the Jian Ghomeshi story, but in the summer of 2015, I was thinking about what I was going to be doing next on the Globe and Mail's investigative team, and at the time, this entire country was just gripped by this question: does the criminal justice system discriminate against women? And I was wondering if there was a way to approach this from an investigative standpoint, that this wasn't just a gut feeling. And I initially thought I would be looking at the court system, and I was interested to see if individuals who had been accused of sexual assault had had previous claims against them dismissed as false. And then I realized, actually, I couldn't do that investigation because the basic data did not exist. It was not possible to find out anything about the number of complaints that were being branded as false or baseless. And that's really what started this story. The Unfounded investigation was two-pronged. One, it was data-focused. How many cases are each police service dismissing as unfounded, which means this is not a real complaint, this is not a legitimate complaint? And then I also looked at 54 specific instances of sexual assault to see what was happening in those investigations. And what it found was that regardless of whether a case was classified as unfounded or not, sexual assault cases were not being treated as seriously as other crimes, despite the fact that it's the second most serious crime in the criminal code. And yes, it took 20 months, and I could talk about it forever, but I'll stop there for now.
And you just said you interviewed dozens of women, I think 54 in total. Was there a key pattern that you noticed in their stories?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, what was really crazy and what I, went against what I was initially thinking is it really didn't matter. Even the cases that went to court had problems. So among the situations I was finding, a lack of understanding around Canadian consent law, that we have an affirmative consent standard. It's not no means no. It's not, no means no does mean no. But it's not that you have to say no or you have to fight or you have to resist. You have to have torn clothing. It's an affirmative consent standard. You have to indicate yes. I found a lack of understanding around our incapacity laws. If someone is too drunk or if they're under duress, you can't consent to sexual activity. I found basic investigative steps like interviewing witnesses, looking for a suspect, collecting surveillance footage, getting a bar bill, things that are done in other types of crimes were routinely not being done in sexual assault investigations.
And as a direct result of the Globe and Mail's investigation, police services across the country have started re-examining the cases that they had previously classified as unfounded. And Leanne, you're the chief of police in Fredericton, and your office started a review of these cases as well.
Yes, we did.
And I wonder, as a female police chief, and I think one of only 9 in Canada, what was it like to hear that when women were coming to the police, their stories were not being taken seriously, including by your own police department?
Well, I'd have to say that when I first heard the story when it broke, and of course I know from the Right to Information requests that there was work being done to examine police response to sexual violence and in the criminal justice system. But when I heard the results, and certainly in the province of New Brunswick, our results were very, very high. I'm here to speak, more on behalf of my own department rather than other police services. And I was pleased in one respect that our department actually was below the national average. We have been doing a lot of things correctly, but that still means that we still had 16% of our cases that were being classified as unfounded. So immediately, as soon as I heard this story and I knew how badly it was reflecting on my own province, I called immediately to some of our community partners and said, this is a big issue. We need to get on this right away. And I have to say that certainly the government of New Brunswick has helped to lead the charge on this going forward. But very upsetting, obviously, to hear that. And
were you surprised?
No. No, not necessarily surprised, disappointed. I've been in policing for 33 plus years, and we have worked very hard over the years to change police response and police intervention and prevention in the area of sexual violence. So I know that there's still a lot of work to do, but I also know how much good work has been done to move the needle in the right direction. And so it was more disappointing than surprising.
And as you said, you've been a police officer for the last 33 years in a workplace that's, I think it's safe to say, pretty male-dominated. Can you talk to me a bit about what's that been like, and have you seen a shift at all in how things were when you first started?
Oh yes, there's been a shift. I have a lot of stories to tell, but
do tell.
But I'll try and keep it concise. No,
we'll let you go off if you want to share.
No, it's been, I've had people say, gee, it's been hard, Chief, the last couple of years, and I'm sure many of you in the audience know that we just lost 2 of our officers and 2 of our citizens a month ago today. And I've had a lot of people say, gee, Chief, you're doing good, and it's been a long, hard year or hard month. And I'm like, actually, it's kind of been a hard 33 plus years. And so it's, yes, I have seen a difference, but it has been through a lot of hard work, a lot of community work to move some of the internal culture of the police department. It doesn't only happen from the inside, it has to happen from the outside in, the inside out, right? And I think that that's one of the fundamentals of this whole discussion, is that there isn't any one aspect of an organization or a profession that is responsible for the unfounded. I think that there's a lot of work that we can do collectively to change things, and so too that's the case within our own policing culture. Right.
Can you give me any specific challenges that you have faced in having this conversation with your own colleagues about the gender biases that may exist? Is there resistance to acknowledging that?
There has been, and I want to be complimentary to those male counterparts who have got it, right? My predecessor was chief of police for a few years before I went into the chief's role, and he was a self-proclaimed feminist before it was cool to be a self-proclaimed feminist, right? You know, looking back over the course of my career, if there was different leadership, my destiny might have been very different, to be honest. So it's, yeah, there's certainly specific examples I can give, most notably, and I have a colleague here that is here representing the International Association of Women Police and also the Atlantic Women in Law Enforcement. And that's where I have found some of my headbutting over the course of my career, is that I still get asked by peers, by subordinates, you know, well, Chief, if you want equality in policing, you know, how come you have this special group for women in policing? And my standard answer has been for a very long time, guys, until I'm the only girl not in the room, I will continue to support the International Association of Women Police, and I will continue to support the Atlantic Women in Law Enforcement. And those are some of the very basic conversations we have. So if you can imagine, just even on that, getting people to understand, both men and women, I might say, getting men and women both to understand that there's a need for that kind of mentorship, development, exposure, networking opportunity to build women up in our profession. And I'm a strong believer in, you know, our safe communities begin at home, and they begin with individual, intimate partner relationships. And if you don't get it right on the front, and if you don't change gender bias and challenge other things in our society, then it breaks down a very, very basic level.
Pam, I want to bring you in on the conversation as well. You've been quite critical of the police, and in particular, their relationship with the Indigenous communities. One of the main things that you say that you want to see happen is more accountability, addressing what you call a culture of impunity. Can you talk to me about what you mean by that?
Well, I think it's really important that we're actually having this conversation on the traditional territory of Mississaugas of New Credit, because this isn't new. This didn't start with Unfounded. This didn't start with, you know, gender equality. This is since Contact. That the perpetrators in our communities have been police officers. The very first perpetrators were police officers as rapists. And this is why we have murdered and missing Indigenous women, because if you're a perpetrator of sexual violence against Indigenous women and girls or Black women or other racialized people, how likely is it that you're going to actually investigate others that come with those claims? And I think this culture of impunity is, the other way of calling it is a culture of corruption. It's when you know one of your other peers are doing something wrong and you don't report it as a police officer. It's when, because for every perpetrator, there's at least 10 that know that's happening and they don't do anything to report it, or worse, they cover it up. And we know the RCMP has done investigations about, you know, widespread corruption in the RCMP. There's been Human Rights Watch reports about police as perpetrators, as rapists, as human traffickers, as manufacturers of child porn, specifically targeting Indigenous women and girls. And why is that? Because this isn't just a gendered issue, this is an intersectionality between gender and race. And they believe as they've colonized the lands in this territory, they've also colonized our bodies, and that venomous mindset has never left the police force. And while things are improving internally, as amongst police officers, you know, there's less discrimination in hiring, less discrimination, you know, in promotions, that says nothing about what's happening between police officers and women on the ground, especially vulnerable Indigenous women and girls.
Leanne, clearly some of the concerns that Pam is raising, you've heard before. What do you say to Pam and other women who don't trust the police that they can protect or help them protect their communities?
This, pardon me, this isn't obviously a new conversation at all, and you know, early in my career I remember sitting on different panels in different work groups at government and the status of women back in the day, now women's equality branches, and having these same conversations, and you know, as a young officer I was really offended, right? I was like, well, hold it, now I don't feel that way about the service that I'm providing in our community, and that was, you know, from the perspective of somebody in their young 20s. But what I do know is that the paintbrush approach to any issue is never, doesn't dig down deep enough to the detail to look at the root cause. And I talk about policing, I talk about recruiting. You know, we recruit from the human race. And are there things within a policing culture that may or may not shape somebody's development or mindset as they go through their career? We're hoping that we're shaping those mindsets and development in the right direction. But we recruit from the human race, and there are no perfect human beings that I'm aware of. And so that's why I say, as a society, we have to address these issues, whether it's race-related, the intersectionality between race and gender and those most vulnerable, and mental health, and the list goes on. And until we have those conversations, both inside organization, outside organization, we are going to continue to see that we don't always get it 100% right. And it's a challenge. We were talking earlier backstage about you know, the recruiting process and the training process. I think most people would be shocked to know in this day and age that our police officers only get 6 months of training before they go out into the field, right? 6 months. And then it's up to individual agencies to continue to train and develop.
Robin, I want to come back to you. Your reporting found some pretty troubling patterns. Moving forward, though, are you optimistic? Is there a path forward to the police culture in this country where you do see changing attitudes?
One of the strangest things that unfolded in my investigation was, as with any time you do a big story, you always give the other side a chance to comment, and you give them, ideally, lots of lead time. So in the months before the story ran, I sent a detailed, I call it my due diligence emails. It's like dozens of questions. It outlines exactly what's in the story, exactly what I'm going to say about this police service, where they fit in the context of the story. I sent it to, you know, more than the 100 of police services that were taking part of the series, and I think 10 responded with a proper response. Most ignored, some sent me a few paragraphs of boilerplate, we're not going to comment. And so I did not have high hopes because there just seemed a complete lack of interest in the series. Well after the story, I actually used Freedom of Information laws to access the email conversations that were taking place between the communications officers, which is my favorite journalism trick. And I saw that when I was sending out these emails, there was this national conversation between all these media relations officers who were making like not an insignificant amount of money to communicate with the public, arguing about the fact that like they don't think they should have to participate in this series. It's not in the public interest to, and again, I'm not painting all police services, but a lot of them. And we don't think it's in the public interest to participate in this series. I'm sick of the media criticizing us. Maybe if we don't respond, she'll just like move away, or like she's confused. Anyway, the series came out and it was like overnight there was reaction. And I have a lot of theories about why that happened. I don't think it's insignificant that we have key women in positions in government that were tweeting, because the government was the same. I'd sent them requests and got very little back. And then our Attorney General and you know, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, Katie Telford, they're tweeting like, read this story, you need to see this. And then I would retweet it, and then I would call the department and be like, well, the minister just tweeted that this is really important. And it was like overnight. And with, you know, we did a big survey at the end of the year to assess, and it's more than half of the country is now being policed by a police service that is actively looking at or already implementing civilian case review. So think about that. These are police services that are saying they're going to the rape crisis centers in their communities and inviting these civilian advocates in to go through the raw police files. This is unheard of that this is happening. Half the country is now living in a police service that is implementing trauma-informed training. 37,000 sexual assault cases were being reviewed because of the series. When I was earlier watching the Prime Minister talk, I got a text message from one of the women featured in the series who had her case dismissed. I will cry because I always cry when I say this. She was raped when she was 13, and her case was dismissed as unfounded, and the guy just was sentenced to 5 years in jail like an hour ago. And I think what's really, I think what's going to happen here is it's a domino effect. Peer pressure is powerful, and if peer pressure is saying, don't talk about the guy that you're seeing at work that's doing something shady or criminal, and now peer pressure is, we need to report on that person who's doing something shady or criminal, or you need to be a police service that's in line with the times, that recognizes that this is not the 1960s anymore. That is where you're going to see change. So even some of the holdouts that, I know I'm giving a really long answer here, but even some of the holdouts in the early months after the series are coming around. And I really think it's peer pressure. Just today I also saw that Angie McNeely in Kingston has been named the new chief of police in Kingston, so another female police chief. And Angie has been instrumental in creating change for, with respect to sexual assault cases since the series came out. And the fact that she was given that platform to make that change and has now been named chief of police is huge. So I am very optimistic. I'm not saying it's going to go away anytime soon. We all need to be vigilant, but I do feel optimistic.
Pam, I want to go back to you and some of the concerns that you raised. What would your main ask be of the Canadian police in order for us to get to a point of change?
I want a public inquiry into every single police force in this country on sexualized violence. That's my first one. The second one is, it's almost like a reverse. We are not going to professional development or cultural awareness training our way out of police raping people. That's something that has to have consequences. There has to be a zero tolerance policy, and many police forces will say, oh, we have a zero tolerance policy. But the only way we will know what's happening is if we get past unions, get past leadership to aggregate data on the number of complaints brought by on police officers. I mean, we've had Human Rights Watch reports come to Canada, put a highlight on police officers raping Indigenous women and girls, not investigating murdered and missing Indigenous women. I mean, I think it's fantastic that there's a review, civilian review over these unfounded cases. But for the National Inquiry on Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women, investigating police is off the table. A forensic review of all those files are off the table. So we still have a problem when it comes to murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, and there has to be consequences. The zero tolerance means you're gone. You don't get a free lawyer, you don't get paid leave, you don't get to go on a 2-year vacation, and then find that, well, we're dismissing these cases. Has to be consequences, we have to root them out.
Robin and Leanne, I want to give both of you the chance for a last word as well. And I wonder if you can answer, what's the main takeaway from a conversation like this? Can we fix the system? Leanne, I'll start with you.
Thank you. Can we fix the system? It's a system that is imperfect. My father used to call it the just ice system. And there's a lot of work to be done. And I think that it is very important to have strong men and women in leadership positions that, as Pamela mentioned, you know, the accountabilities, the ethics, the integrity. It's a complicated issue that requires a complicated response. And I think, you know, my own track record with my department has been solid. But even at that, even I'm proud of the work that we've done. I know that we can continue to improve.
I think just to Pamela's point, the change that came about in Canada was brought about by journalism. And a big problem that we have in this country, I know we're very overshadowed by our dark and gloomy neighbor, and it makes us feel like we're living in the world of rainbows and unicorns. And I'm not saying that that's not true in some areas, but this series took me 20 months to report. I'm very grateful to work with the Globe and Mail that funded this. I think it cost a little more than $500,000 to do this investigation. The unfounded numbers took me more than a year to collect through hundreds of Freedom of Information requests. The FBI sent me the unfounded numbers for the United States in a couple of hours after I emailed them. Canada has obsessively restrictive transparency laws around access to information. We wouldn't need the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Inquiry to do a forensic audit of police services and have the government do it if journalists could do it. And journalists can't do it because police files, like all government files in this country, are Canada shields them. Like, very ridiculous. In the United States, BuzzFeed did a review of unfounded cases as well, and they were able to obtain the police files from the sexual assault cases. They were redacted, and not everyone gave it to them, but a lot of police services did. I had to get the sexual assault complainants themselves to file for the Freedom of Information request. There is a balance between personal privacy and transparency, but Canada always errs on the side of privacy, and it shields our democracy from being the best thing that we can be. So that, I think, is something that you can all take away to remove the rainbow sunglasses here and be woke on that front too.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone on the stage for this incredible conversation. We will now take a quick break. I'm told only 10 minutes, so please be back here at 3:07.